You know that? I didn't do anything different. It just had to warm up, I guess. Well, good morning to everyone. Certainly glad to see everybody today. I trust that you've had enough rain for a while. Seems like we all have. So we're studying the parables, and we'll get to that in a minute. I'm going to get up here close to Wayne, and I may end up sitting on his knee here in a minute. But perhaps not. Let's see, we got a few senior citizens in here. You qualify for senior citizens, I guess. George, you qualify. Doris will be in another year. She'll be ready for senior citizen. You know, it was on this day in 1965 that the first Marines were sent to Vietnam. First Marines. The French had actually lost that war, if you want to call it a war, way back in 1954, and they just threw up their hands and got out. Truman had been faced with it. Kennedy was faced with it, but it remained really for Lyndon Johnson. And you may not remember the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which allowed us to send Marines over there. Seemed like a long time ago, 1965. And so this past, wasn't that many, right? But what a disaster. Before that thing was over with, we had 500,000 troops, American servicemen in Vietnam. American troops fighting an American war. We had 58,000 deaths, maybe 150,000 wounded. 2 million Vietnamese civilians lost their lives. Over 1 million North Vietnamese troops lost their lives, and 200,000 South Vietnamese lost their lives. And guess what? In 1975, we pulled out. And the status quo was, I guess you'd call it the status quo. It's really something. This was the second police action, if you want to call it that, that the United States undertook. The first was Korea. Didn't end up all that well either, but the United States had this penchant for thinking we had to be the patrolman for the world. And there's something to be said for that, but when you go that long, from 1965 to 1974 or 5, and you really don't accomplish anything except a lot of people are dead, it was, it was on the evening news every day, and people saw what was going on. Now, war is real close to you. Things that happen, and so created a whole lot of dissension in this country. And in fact, it directly led to Lyndon Johnson, who was the president, as you know, of him deciding that he would not seek re-election. And probably rightfully so. He would undoubtedly not gotten elected if he had. Anyway, that was on this day in 1965. Seemed like a long time ago, doesn't it? For us old people, we remember it pretty good. Today we're continuing our study of the parables, and we're in Matthew chapter 13. And before we do that, I'm going to recap just a tad on the parable of the sower. Remember that as the sower went forth to sow, and he sowed, and some seed fell on the rocky ground. Some fell among the thorns. Some fell by the wayside. Some fell on good ground. And if we look at that story, then we might suppose that it's a pretty good chance that if you're a salesman and you're making calls, that you might sell one to every fourth person. And that may not be true depending on what you're in. If you're an automobile salesman like Wayne was, about every 2 people come in there, you're going to sell them. Maybe even better than that. Because they're looking, right? But now if you were like a famous, renowned calculator salesman of antiquity, who shall remain anonymous, you had to make a lot more calls than that in order to make one sale. But you generally knew what it was. I mean, you could work that out. And you say, and a salesman loves to hear no. Well, he doesn't really love to hear no. But you see, if you don't hear the no's, you don't get a yes. So I don't think that we can deduce from this parable here, the parable of the sower, that every fourth person you talk to would be somebody you would convert or sell the gospel to put it another way. However, it is indicative of the fact that not everyone you speak to, not everybody who hears a lesson is going to respond positively. We talked about that last week as well. In fact, you think that's the real point of this? What is the basic lesson of the parable of the sower? What is he saying here? He's saying there's all kind of different people is basically what he's saying, right? There's all sorts of people in the world. We talked about those who reject, who slam the door on you, and those who are not interested. And what would you say is the biggest obstacle today? Or what do you think is at least one of the most significant obstacles of trying to teach the truth to somebody today? What do you think it is? Indifference. Well, that's right. Why indifference? Why are people indifferent? What do you think? They don't care. Well, that's pretty close to being indifferent. So what's the root of that? Why don't they care? They're supposed to care. You go to Russia. You remember going to Ukraine first. I remember going to Russia first. You go to India today. You go to Africa today. And guess what? You got people that are listening. I think it's got something to do with color television. Now, color television just represents a whole lot of other things. And I got to tell you that the Russians love color television as good as anybody else, if they get it. The Indians will love it too, if they get it. The people in Africa will love it too, if they get it. So what are we saying? We're saying our way of life today in this country, our way of life is one of the largest obstacles, one of the biggest obstacles to teaching the gospel. And we have to realize that and face it. Is that a reason not to teach? What do you think? Well, let's give up, throw our hands up. Throw in the towel. No need in talking to people. There's a lot to that. There ain't no need in talking to people. But that does not relieve us of the responsibility of teaching. We just have to change our tactics. We have to realize what we're facing. And believe me, it's a problem. You go and, for instance, knock on somebody's door today. There's a time when people might, maybe they weren't so pleased you were there, but they might at least be amicable. They might be receptive to some extent. But you don't find that very much today, I tell you. Because people are preoccupied, they are busy, and they really just don't want to take time. I know that you, like I, have had people to come to your door, and you know who they are. There's two main groups that do that, okay? And sometimes you've asked them in or taken a few minutes to talk to them. And, of course, they don't want to hear what you have to say. They're not interested. They're interested in what they have to say. And if you're interested in that, fine. But if not, then it doesn't take long for them to be disenchanted of anything you had to say. So it is a different world. And it's a frightening world, a frightening society that we live in today. And none of us has the answer to that, at least not a very satisfactory answer. And I think I know the people in this room pretty good, at least some of them. We can go to that second slide now. If you had an opportunity to talk to somebody, a real legitimate opportunity, and they were willing to listen, you'd be more than happy to talk with them, right? Sure you would. And we always browbeat ourselves because we're not doing anything. We're not converting folks. We're not baptizing people. But we'd be very happy to sit down with anybody who's interested, wouldn't we? So the point is, where do we find these folks? Well, if you've got an idea about that, let me know. Let me know. But I think that all of us have a circle of influence. And I got to admit that I certainly have not been as diligent in that respect as I should have been. There are times when I had a pretty big circle of acquaintances, and I did make some attempts to teach people, not very successfully. And I compare that to the way it was in the 1960s. And I recall that at least once a week, myself and another person would go out and we would have a session or meeting in somebody's house. We would use the famous Jules Miller film strip. Some of you real old people remember that, right? And we were very successful. We taught a lot of people. We baptized many people that way. And now I'm not sure there's anything suitable as a replacement for that. I've seen some things that weren't bad, but I've never seen any single vehicle that was as expedient, convenient as the Jules Miller film strips. I haven't seen anything like that. So not only have the people in our country changed, but the methods of teaching have definitely changed. All right, so we're going to the parable of the tares now, and then reading from Matthew chapter 13 and verse 24. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while man slept, his enemy came and sowed tares also among the wheat, and went away. But when the wheat sprang up and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. I don't care how careful you are, you can't keep from making a grammatical mistake on this stuff. And the slaves of the landowner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? And he said to them, An enemy has done this. And the slave said to him, Do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, No, lest while you are gathering up the tares, you may root up the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, First gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn. Then Jesus sent the multitudes away and went into the house. And his disciples came, I'm skipping down now. His disciples came to him saying, Explain to us the parable of the tares of the field. And he answered and said, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. And the field is the world. And as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom. And the tares are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. And the harvest is the end of the ages. And the reapers are the angels. Therefore, just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks, and those who commit lawlessness, and cast them into the furnace of fire. In that place there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. So isn't it interesting, it is to me, that Jesus told the first parable about the sowers and he explained that. Then he had a couple of others, and then, or he's talking about the tares, and then he has two other parables, and he leaves and goes into the house away from the multitude. We're not told what's going on all of this time. His disciples come to him and said, Tell us about the tares. They didn't say anything about the mustard seed or the leaven. That's kind of interesting. Maybe they had a grasp on that, but they wanted to know about the tares, and so he explained it to them. He said, first of all, the field represents the world, which is interesting because he uses the expression that go and gather out of my kingdom all things that offend those who have lawlessness and so on. However, in the other parables, for instance, the parable of the leaven, the parable of the mustard seed, it says what the kingdom of heaven is like. Mustard seed. The kingdom of heaven is like a woman who hid 3 measures of, or leaven in 3 measures of meal. So we're used to the kingdom here being what? What's the kingdom representing in these parables normally? Well, you got the answer to that. It's the church. That's what it usually represents, but not in this case. I think that's quite interesting. Now, some have thought that it did, but no, there's no way. Jesus tells what it is. He says it's the world. The field here is the world. And we have a reference here at 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4. And if we were to read that, what would we read? Well, let's turn over there and see if we can find it, and we'll see what it reads. 2 Corinthians 4 and 4 says, in whose case the God of this world, he's talking about the people who the gospel is veiled to, whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. So who is the God of this world? Well, it's obviously Satan, isn't it? And this leads some people to say we ought to withdraw in every possible way we can from matters of the world. I know a man once who was intending to run for elected office, and he let that be known. And not long after, a prominent brother called him and said, I'd like to talk to you. And certainly revering this older gentleman, who was a patriarch in the faith, he went and sat down and talked with him. And he said, look, you've got no business running for public office. He said, that's the kingdom of Satan, that's the world, and Christians have nothing to do with that. You ought to stay away from it. It's bad stuff. Well, what about that? Is that right or not? Good question, isn't it? There's another way of looking at it. Suppose you had a lot of Christians in public office. Well, things would be a little different, wouldn't they? Sure. So I don't think we need to be so emphatic about how the world is run. Yeah, in a sense, and certainly in this sense, it's inarguable that Satan is the God of the world. What does that mean? The people of the world. But does he really run the world? Does he run it? He has a great influence, but he don't run it. Who runs the world? Well, we got a psalm here where David tells us who runs the world. Well, we don't have to read that, but he's in control of everything. He's in control of the affairs of men and nations. And of course, from Isaiah, we had a great study on Isaiah. Jeremiah, you know that God intervened providentially. And you know, and of course, we had a great lesson last Sunday night from Brother Melvin talking about Nineveh and Nahum, the prophet, and how God intervened. Now, you can't look at the affairs and the events and say, well, God's doing this. He's moving the things around like a player on the chessboard. He's moving one here and moving one there. You can't do that. But he's in control of everything today. And we need to remember that whatever happens, eventually, it may not be today, it may not be next week, it might not be the Vietnam War, it might not be the presidential election, it might not be any of those things, but he will eventually work things out to his will, okay? And so we know that, and as Christians, if we know that, we don't need to be worrying too much about things that happen. We may be involved, and that's good, but we do not need to become discouraged. I mean, you can look at our society today and say, man, you know, we got trouble in River City, and that's right. But that trouble in River City does not mean that we as Christians will not be taken care of. When we compare our circumstances today to those people of the first century who endured such persecution, yet they were God's people, remember? God did not forget them. So he's not about to forget us. Okay, and he said the sower in this parable goes into the field and he sows good seed. Now, this is the first thing. You've got to have good seed when you're sowing if you want the right kind of crop. And the good seed is what? That's Christians. Yeah. So he's sowing something that's good, which will make Christians. That's the wheat. And notice in this parable, as we have down here, that there's nothing but wheat and tares. What is that famous song, the Thanksgiving song? Wheat and tares together sown. Remember? Okay, so that breaks it down pretty simply. And that's really kind of a demarcation that we are not comfortable with. We are not comfortable with saying that there's over here on this hand there's tares and this hand there's wheat. Well, that's what the Bible is teaching, isn't it? That's pretty serious. You think about this. Do you imagine? Do you imagine that there are tares, in fact, in the world today that would answer this description? Must be tares in the world today. So this is a serious proposition for us. And I noticed that in this parable, the slaves, and apparently it's interesting to me that it says the Son of Man is the sower here, and he's the one that sows the seed. It's indicated that these slaves, or these men, either they're just going to harvest it or they might have helped him. I don't know. But they're the ones that are going to help harvest it, okay? You know, he didn't deliberately sow bad seed. But something else is coming up. And we talked about that. And so they asked him, they said, "Sir, did you not sow good seed out here? Well, where are these tares coming from?" And his answer, "An enemy has done this." And they said, "Okay, well, you want us to then go and pluck them up, the tares?" He said, "No, don't do that. Let them grow together until the harvest." And he says the harvest is the end of the world. You see, God has appointed a time, and Paul tells the people at Athens, Areopagus, that he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world through that man whom he's appointed, Jesus Christ. So there will be a separation. We're given the scene of judgment in Matthew chapter 25, other references to that as well. So here are the reapers, and they represent the angels going to separate at the harvest, the tares. You'll gather them up. What's going to be burned? What's going to be burned here? The good or the bad? Well, it's pretty evident. Tares are going to be burned. You ever think about the role of angels? We encounter angels a lot of time in the Scriptures. One of the most interesting ones, and I put it down here, Numbers 22, is the occasion of Balaam. You know, Balaam was going along beside the wall on his donkey, and he was going where God didn't want him to go. And he looked up. He didn't see anything to start with, but the burro did, and he shied away and ran his leg into the wall. And he started beating him. And the donkey spoke to him and said, "Why are you beating me? I've always served you faithfully." And then Balaam looks up and he sees this angel standing there with a sword, realizing he didn't want to go there. I thought that's kind of interesting. An angel is standing there waiting on him. There are many occasions where angels do things, right? But in the last day, they're going to gather up the tares, and the righteous they're going to carry away. And of course we have the great story of the rich man and Lazarus, where it said that Lazarus died, and what happened to him? He was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom, right? So do we conclude from that when we die, the angels will carry us away? Maybe so. That's a great thought, isn't it? And we got a lot of hymns in our book about the angels coming, right? "Oh, come angel band, coming around me stand. Bear me away on your snowy wings to my immortal home." You ever heard that song? Yeah. Yeah. So maybe that's what happens. That's a great thought, isn't it? So But let's rest our minds about those who die of our number and what's going to happen to them. Angels are going to come get you. Take you to Abraham's bosom. Nothing better than that. In fact, those who are there, if they could come back today, they wouldn't come back. No. You may miss them, they may miss you, but they would not come back. Why? They'd say, well, I'm sorry. You just have to do without me because this is a lot better than anything else. Anything we ever had on earth. So yes, we mourn when we miss them and are severed from their fellowship, but we need to rejoice that the angels have taken them. Isn't that a glorious thought? But now wait, what about the tares? It looks like the angels are going to come get them too, doesn't it? But instead of taking them to Abraham's bosom, they're going to take them to someplace. You know, that's pretty serious. Our children sing up here, or they say, in response to the question, what's true success in life? Living your life, going to heaven when this life is over. And boy, that's right, isn't it? What is true failure in life? Living your life and going to hell. Boy, that's a hard word. Hell is a hard word. It's hard to say. It's hard to think about. I mean, we'd rather not do it, tell you the truth. I don't like to think about that for anybody. But the Bible is just filled with references to punishment, to hell. Over and over again. You can't escape it. Not if you're going to teach the truth, if you're going to believe the truth, if you're going to read the truth, you can't. But that's real serious, and that's why. That's why we have brethren today who really don't want to preach on hard things. Because, see, we all have acquaintances that we respect. We know. People that we work with, that we do business with, that are good folks. And so what are you telling me? That if people do not follow what the New Testament teaches, if they're not New Testament Christians, that they don't have a promise of salvation? Are you telling me that? Well, yeah. I'm sorry. That's what the Bible teaches, isn't it? You're not comfortable with that? Well, in a way, I'm not really comfortable with it. But that's it, you know. And it's a serious thing to think about what happens to the unrighteous. It's a terrible experience. The tares will be burned up. Now, a literal fire, no. I don't know what kind of fire it is. But it's a place of punishment, outer darkness. And it says, Jesus said, there'll be weeping, gnashing of teeth. Now, if you've ever had severe pain, and most of you have at one time or another, we don't have too many encounters of that today because we got drugs. You got drugs. But maybe you've been hurt badly enough that you just gritted your teeth like this. Well, that's what he's talking about. That's the reality. That's the reality that we face. And that's why Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, knowing therefore the terror of the Lord, we persuade men. It's pretty good motivation. We forget that. And we like to minimize it. But it's in the Bible. And if we're going to be honest, then we have to teach it. So then, while men slept, what's meant by that? Do you think these people are at fault that slept? Were they daytime sleepers? What's the indication to you? Do you think they're sleeping in the daytime? Not said, is it? Maybe they were sleeping at night. That's what you generally do. Whenever it was, this enemy came and he sowed the tares among the good seed. Now, we spoke about this last week to some extent, but this time of the year, if you look out and see, especially if you have Bermuda grass, Yep. You got some weeds growing up right now. Some of them will die out as it gets hot, but some of them will not. I used to be so frustrated with nutgrass. When it first starts to come up, it looks like the regular grass, green. You can get by with it. Doesn't take long. But this time of the year, you'll see a lot of weeds springing up. And if you're trying to do a garden, then that's the one thing you don't want. But here, these things came up, and so they must have been, he didn't sow it among the thorns, as we noticed last week. He just put down the good seed. But somebody, an enemy came while men slept. Were the men who were sleeping at fault? Was it their fault? No indication it was their fault. But the enemy came. And our ancient enemy is at work today in the hearts and the lives of people, as he's always been. When we read the story of Genesis and the fall of man, you might get the idea that they lived there, Adam and Eve lived there a long, long time before Satan came. I don't believe that's the case, personally. I don't think he left them alone very long. I think he came on the scene pretty soon. And he told a great lie that had some truth in it. And he's still telling a lot of lies that have some truth. So he is the great deceiver of men. And he sowed this bad seed. And they're going to grow together. So how long will the tares and the wheat grow together? Until the harvest. And so sometimes you can't tell the difference, can you? You might not can tell the difference. Our society certainly benefits from good moral people. Let it be noted that we would be much worse off were it not for good moral people. But good moral people who have not obeyed the gospel, who are not faithful Christians, can't claim to be among the good seed with the wheat. I'm sorry. They can't. And we can't pretend that they are. That again raises a very serious question to it. And we need to remember that they're here. And we asked a question a few minutes ago. Do you think we got tares today? Do you think, for instance, that impenitent criminals are tares? We will all probably agree with that, right? And then I think we would have to say that we probably all have acquaintances that are tares. What do you get from the statement that Jesus makes? He who has ears, let him hear. Everybody got ears, right? What does it mean? He who has ears, let him hear. Or in another case, he said ears to hear, let him hear. So that kind of qualifies it. If you got ears that can hear, listen. In other words, what I'm saying is very important, so pay attention to it. And notice also that in the parable of the sower and here the tares, since they're mixed together, indicates that a person may be in fact lost. And that's what represents by the people, of course, who was on the thorns, right? Somebody who started off, but they fell away, got choked out by the cares and riches of this world. So that is certainly another consideration. And let us remember from Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 9 and 10, remember this: go and tell this people, keep on listening but do not perceive, keep on looking but do not understand. Render the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull, their eyes dim, lest they see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and return and be healed. So, what is it for you and me to take to heart? He who has ears, let him hear. It means that the teaching of the Bible, the things that we have been taught and are being taught, and when we read, these are life serious. Everything that the Bible teaches. So we need to be attentive to that and careful how we hear and what we hear. We could use this in many respects, of course. If you're here today, that means you set your clock right. Okay? And that's a good thing. But I'm thinking about days when we had classes and maybe you hadn't slept real good the night before, and you came to class, and I'm talking about college class here, maybe even high school class. It could be a Bible class, but hopefully not. And so you kind of wearied. You kind of washed out. And don't let it be because you stayed at a ball game too late on Saturday night and came to class on Sunday morning and you wasn't quite ready. But maybe you can remember the days when you tried to get as far in the back of the room, or sort of you could, and you put your chin on your elbow and you looked down at your book, and almost, if you had dark glasses, you could just about get away with nodding a little bit, right? Before you nodding too much. Well, I think it goes without saying much that you're not listening too good. If it's a lecture, of course, the fact is a college professor doesn't care too much whether you're listening, right? I mean, he really might care, but he's not going to get too upset about it because it's your grade. High school is a little different. They may come around with the thing they used to have, a little knocker, a little deal on the end of it, and if you nodded in church, that's right. They used to do this. Congregations in Massachusetts, if you've been to Massachusetts and gone to the North Church, you go in and they've got the pews that are named, and that's where people sat. And then you had a guy in the back that had this long stick with a little ball on the end of it. And if you started nodding, he'd come and tap you on the head. They really did that. Well, they didn't do that in college because the professor thought if you're old enough to be here, you're old enough to get this or not get it. And so you could sit there and doze if you wanted to, but guess what? When it came test day, if you hadn't listened, you hadn't paid attention, too bad. And it reminds me of the student who the professor had issued some questions, and one of them, the student said, answered it, and he said, "Only God knows." That was his answer. And he turned the paper in, and the professor gave his paper back to him, and it said, "God 100, you 0." So we have to be careful that we are hearing what we ought to be hearing. And that's in Bible class. It's when the lesson is being taught. And at any other time. Yes, sir. His comment is that we might think that God will snatch up the unbelievers or the unrighteous, but He's letting them stay. Do you remember that a famous wise man said, because a sentence is not executed speedily, so the heart of man is set in him to do mischief, right? So if the sentence is not executed speedily, we just, in fact, executed a man that was convicted how many years ago? I don't know. This is a shame and it's a travesty. It is not justice to allow somebody to stay on death row for 20 years when you go through the appeal, because the family of the victim and society suffers because of that. It's a terrible thing. And I recall very well that there are many efforts made to appeal directly to the Supreme Court in capital cases. And I think that's the way it ought to be. so that they get a speedy hearing, and then that matter could be settled. But hey, if you got somebody that has triple murders on his hand, and he gets convicted, and he stays in the appeal process, and for 20 years, 16 years or something, then the impact of justice is not the same. And I believe that's one of our problems in society today, is because people don't think, well, I can go and do this or that, and yeah, I may get a little bit of a fine or something, but it's not going to be a big deal. So our justice system could stand some improvement today. But it is true that the evil people live amongst us. The tares live among the wheat. But eventually, God will settle everything. And I tell you, we live with this realization. And what I don't quite understand, I don't grasp this. Because those who are faithful still are concerned about their... none of us believes that our works will justify us. None of us believes that. But still at the same time, we're conscious of our efforts, of our Christianity, of our faithfulness, if you please. And even then, people say, well, I hope I'm all right. Oh, I know we've got brethren that are very sure of their salvation. And maybe that's good. Oh, it is good. As long as you're not cocksure. But I got to be honest with you, I have never gotten to the point where I say, well, Lord, I'm okay, just come get me. I've never quite gotten there. Maybe it's a failure of mine, John, I don't know. But I got to believe it's kind of humanity. As long as we're in this life, we want to live because God's put that into us. And then we always say, well, I hope I'm all right. I think I'm all right. I think I'm ready to die. But it's just a tad of uncertainty still lingers. But if that's true for the righteous, how in the world is it people can live the way they do without a thought of, I got to face God in the judgment? I don't know. I don't know, because I tremble to think about it. I tremble to think about standing in the judgment. I tremble to think about hell. In fact, I can't imagine, can't even think about going there myself. I just shut that out of my mind. But a lot of people seem to give that no consideration at all, and they live however they want to in this world. In fact, you've seen this little paper, I guess, they send out, local papers, a little 3 or 4 page thing, and they have mug shots. And you ever see those things? The mug shots of the criminals of the last week? Man, there's a bunch of them in there. And there'd be 8 or 10 or 12 mug shots of criminals and the things they've done. And I asked myself, look at these people. They're out of control. I just read recently, Prattville, this is a good place to be. Prattville's a nice place. Millbrook, police chief said things are awful. We got people that are multiple offenders as far as thieving. They go into the same store and they've been there 6 or 7 times and robbed the same store, looted the same store. That ain't the right word, but they stole something from that store. And he said, I've never seen anything like this. People just keep stealing. It's drugs. Drugs, drugs, drugs. How in the world our society has gotten where it has on drugs is beyond me. Drugs have no father and no mother. Somebody on drugs will do anything to keep that habit going. And yet, in their sane moments, how is it that they don't think that sometime they're going to have to face either the authorities and God, or certainly God? Most people have a conscience. And how is it that you can live with a seared or guilty conscience and not think about judgment? God forbid that we should ever be one of these tares, or that we would ever lend any support to one that is a tare. Okay, so we might have gotten off on some things here, but again, The tares and the wheat are growing together. Thank you very much for your attention.